Okay, amigos, this is it. Ned, big smile, Dusty. Just relax and have fun with it.
I'm just gonna have fun with it.
I'm Lucky Dave.
I'm Ned Niederlander.
I'm Dusty Barnum. So together we're
the Three Amigos.
Welcome to the Remarkable Retail Podcast, Season 2, Episode 19. I'm Michael LeBlanc.
And I'm Steve Dennis.
Well, Steve, as listeners may have picked up, it is the Three Amigo episode, which is a reunion of that time, IRL, as the kids are now saying, in real life, where we sat down together with retail strategist Carl Boutet from Montreal at Retail Council Canada SOAR 2019, big conference. You were the keynote, so I took advantage of having the three of us in the same place at the same time. We had a great chat.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. I'm really waxing nostalgic about those times when I got to stand up in front of a bunch of people and make a fool of myself and then meet up with many, many colleagues, including you and Carl. So yeah, that was a good time. And I'm hoping we'll get to do that in real life in the not too distant future, but we shall see.
Well, in the interim, until our borders are open and we're all back together, we thought we'd get together on the podcast. So we invited Carl, and he's got lots of great things going on, including a new book. And the book has a really, it's about the Great Acceleration, which he coined, I think, as he described, he coined it first, picked up on your book launch, your first book launch. So he's got an interesting approach even to how he writes the books, right? So it's a different, not just a different vibe, but a different process and a more evergreen approach, trying to encompass this fast-moving thinking on the what and how the Great Acceleration and what it means to read.
Yeah, I'm sort of envious as we get into in the interview about being able to put content out or create content and put it out essentially in real time or a lot closer to the market. Whereas with books, my book, I had to basically be done with the primary writing 6-7 months before it actually came out. So I think it's a really interesting approach. And I think Carl's actually absolutely been a pioneer on this idea of the Great Acceleration, which I think is now pretty well accepted. The thing I think was interesting was when that first was coined, there was a lot of noise around how we were jumpstarting 10 years into the future. And
right.
That's turned out, I think, to be, depending on the category, much more like 2 or 3 years. But I think absolutely there's no going back. And it's a question of really figuring out what these changes, what this acceleration means for your particular company, your particular category.
Yeah, and particularly as I think about e-commerce, it really accelerated certain categories more than other. I think of grocery. It was going to grow, but I think it was potentially a big leap forward. And so it's not an equal, applies equally to all. So anyway, yeah, it's a great conversation. And I just want to remind the listeners that we're wrapping up season 2 next week with a really great guest that'll give us and the listeners a very big picture perspective. Matt Shea, president of the NRF. And then we're going to take a bit of a break and a little bit of a summer hiatus as we kind of gear up for season 3. And next episode, we'll tell you more about what season 3 is going to look like and some other exciting stuff we got planned. But all right, well, listen, we got a great episode ahead, so let's just jump right in. Carl, welcome to the Remarkable Retail Podcast, my friend. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me here. I'm so excited. I finally get to meet Steve Dennis.
Usually I charge for this, so I feel very lucky.
Michael told me I sent money to Michael.
What's funny?
He told me it was going to you.
You both charge for this, so it's actually just it's actually transfer pricing rates.
Okay.
Long overdue to get you on our new podcast. You've got a book written out. A few things have happened since the last time we've been together. So thanks again for joining us. And listen, for those who may not know of you or have heard of you or don't know enough about you, any one of those three, tell us a bit about your background and who you are and what you do.
Who am I? I am Carl Boutet, based in Montreal, Quebec. And when I grow up, I want to be just like Steve and you. And I am a retail strategist / prescriptor, if I get fancy with the trademark. And the idea is helping businesses, retailers, and the solution providers that enter into the equation for the retailers to be more relevant and sustainable in their go-to-market practices. So that's a really long way to say I try my best to do what I can.
I like that. So we're going to get into your new project, or project, as some people say, the Great Acceleration. which is a book. It's a multimedia thing. I don't even know what it is. You can tell us more about that in a second. But I do believe that you first used the term in public, the Great Acceleration, on my virtual book launch event, which was like 13 or 14 months ago. Do I have that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been working on a book project, and yeah, it's a shifting dynamic, and there is a book. We can talk about that later. But I did have the guts for the first time to sort of propose the idea as the word acceleration was being pronounced more and more by different business leaders and media pundits, that there would be a possibility that we could look back on this period of, especially on the business side of this period, as the Great Acceleration, in the context of we've had the Great Depression and the Great Recession, and at least optimistically, there's obviously some true downsides to all this, but that we could choose to look back on this period as the Great Acceleration, just because so many trends, so many business dynamics that we've the three of us have been talking about for years. We had the impression, especially last spring when your book launch was, Steve, that this was April, I think mid-April. We were like 6 weeks into this, and we just felt like, okay, things are sort of being pulled forward here. And hence, yeah, that was the first time. And that was actually when you and I, Steve, were talking with Scott Galloway. When Scott popped in from his gazebo in Florida,
his secret underground lair, that overground.
Yeah, to support and congratulate your book launch, and so I think he used the word acceleration, and that's where I started intervening, because it'd been spinning around in my head for some time. So we'll be looking, and it was early days, right? So I put a stake in it, and then you were nice enough to share that as well and give me attribution for that. So I appreciate. And so and then now the idea is, since then, sort of tracking that and the ebbs and flows of the acceleration. But I'm convinced that there are some parts of the business dynamics that have accelerated for good and for bad. But there is a feeling of no going back in some of these. But in others, which I know you'll push back on with me, are maybe some of it's being slightly exaggerated, but that's what we're here to talk about.
Let's dive into it. First of all, talk about the book. Why did you write it? Who's it for? What do you hope readers will take away from it?
I opened the book by talking about how it's like been a 5-year project. Quite honestly, I had a business school reunion dinner 5 years ago in Toronto, and my business strategy prof, who sat next to me for the whole dinner, we were just jamming, and we kept in good close touch over the years. Prior to that, around sort of all the shifting by business dynamics, and we were both very interested, especially in how the business models, and not just in retail, but a whole bunch of sectors were changing under a lot of pressure. And by the end of the dinner, he started looking, he goes, you have a book in you. And I'd never even heard that term before. And I was sort of shell shocked by it. And I was like, kind of shook it off, whatever. And then on my way back home, I was like, I wonder what that means. And if I were to write a book, what would it be around? And 2016 actually came across this recently. I did a LinkedIn post around retail relevance. What does that even mean? What does it mean to be relevant? And that was where I was starting with the idea of talking about what would make you relevant and how could you measure it. And I built some frameworks around that, using some of the research Barbara Kahn did at Wharton and some other things. So that was originally what I was going to be thinking about talking about. In early 2020, January pre-pandemic, I was really reflecting a lot on sustainability and the role of sustainability as part of that relevance. And then I was like, maybe I should dedicate more of this to the notion of how we're broadening the sustainability agenda as the triple bottom line stuff and all that good work, and tie that to relevance. And I even written an article for Retail Insider where I said that would be the greatest trend of the next decade, with direct-to-consumer being the greatest trend of the previous decade. And then I flew off to Asia, chaired the ASEAN Retail Conference, the first, out in Bangkok, and on the way back flew through Shanghai, spent several days in Shanghai, where I sort of was, ground zero of a bunch of things, including obviously the future of retail in a lot of ways, but without knowing it, ground zero also of or close to ground zero of the launch of this global pandemic. And when I came back from that third week of January, I, sort of had this tsunami, seemed to be just ahead of this tsunami wave, staying very close to Chinese businesses and how they were reacting and adjusting to it, much better prepared clearly than we would be, just because of what they'd already gone through with SARS and all that, and wanted to communicate that to the businesses here. And then the book sort of took a whole other turn, and I was it was about, okay, then the word acceleration came along, and on your book launch, coining the Great Acceleration. And then the idea is, okay, so how do we prepare, or how do we best navigate this acceleration? What does it mean? How does it relate back to my previous focuses around sustainability and remaining relevant? And also, what are the data points? I've always been very data centric or data driven. So I was really interested in sort of tracking around the world what those data points were that spoke to the acceleration, especially the e-commerce adoption part. So I guess a month ago now, I launched a little over 2 weeks ago, and I was still updating content like a month ago, because one of the challenges, and you know this well, Steve, is when you're writing a book, I mean, you had to write basically a second one within a year. It just, in our environment, doing something that's so static is a challenge. So the idea was that this is more than a book. It's like using it more the term project, because what it's meant to be is the launch of a subscription service for those looking to better navigate these waters. And especially as my thesis is that we're heading to a 50-50 world of physical and digital, how to best navigate those waters or surf that wave.
So really, in the tradecraft of writing the book, I wanted to touch on that for a few minutes. It sounds like you've got a mix of data, interviewed people. I think you interviewed Scott Galloway, for example, other people you've mentioned. So that's the tradecraft. So take me a little bit through the tradecraft.
So the idea, I mean, I'm basically giving the book away. If you think about the idea, it's $12.99 for the digital format. And what I'm looking to do is launch a subscription, what I'm doing is launching a subscription service in mid-June. So the book came out May 19th. So by June 19th, the subscription will launch and will be $5 a month, where it'll be exclusive content, interviews, data points, the things that you find already in the book that are sort of being instigated, who will be built upon. And that'll be $5 a month. So, and the idea, people buy the book, get the first 3 months of the subscription free. So the book basically comes out as free. And the book is only available on my website, which is a lot of friction, because we do the book because there's a credibility factor. Obviously, we do the book because it sort of helps us lay out some groundwork that we want to build upon, frameworks like Steve's, that we know are going to evolve and adapt, and that's what we want to sort of put out there. But at the same time, the cycles, I'm involved in a more academic one. I'm just writing a chapter for a more academic one, and it's like a 12-month process. So it's I don't know. I'm just trying something out here. It's a bit novel.
But maybe let's get into a little bit more depth on what you mean by the Great Acceleration. Because, I talk a little bit, well, I guess one observation I've had for a while is that it has felt to me like the pace of change has been accelerating for maybe over a decade. I don't know to exactly say, but, things are just changing ever more quickly. And I think without a doubt, the pandemic amplified many aspects of where we were seeing change. But what specifically do you see as the Great Acceleration? What are the main things you observed while writing the book, and maybe just bring it to the current state in terms of what's really most important, most relevant for retailers and brands to think about doing differently by virtue of this acceleration?
What I came to realize, I think what really the Great Acceleration is meant to represent, at least at this period in time, was spring 2020. We go into lockdown pretty much across the planet, or at least the better part and we're sort of pushed into new behaviors. And I say new behaviors, they're actually behaviors that were already happening. Just they were still quite marginal, and most of that around e-commerce. And that spring, that time when we were doing your book launch, and that whole period was when you look back on it, it almost felt like we got a portal into the future. We got to see sort of what we were expecting 10 years from now could look like. And once this was imposed on us, we didn't gradually get there at that nice steady rate we thought we would, especially with e-commerce adoption. And I'm even trying to get away from the word e-commerce and talk more and more about digitally enabled commerce. We had, just because we had no choice, anything that was non-essential, we were forced onto these platforms that we might have already been using a bit here and there, but now was pretty much the only way forward. And some of the data points that I like to share to make that story clearer, for instance, one that was really strong to me was did an event with our friends from Canada Post here. The new chief operating officer was relating how he took over the position February 2020. Great timing. Thankfully he'd come from Asia, where he led DHL's e-commerce division, so he knew about scale. And basically he had a roadmap to build out the logistics capability of Canada Post. And in May 2020, hit the volumes that his project plan had anticipated for 2029. So, I mean, that was a real data point. Obviously, it didn't stay at that level, and it reverted back as we came out of that first wave of lockdowns. But it still showed that was sort of an idea of the portal. And I was doing events in emerging markets, places like Nepal and all that, where they all had stories like this around digital payment adoption, or more on the logistics and all these sectors. Everybody was like, we were doing things we were thinking we were going to do 10 years from now. This pushed us to like 30% digital, 70, and maybe some cases, depending on which sectors, could be a lot more than that. And it came back to like in between. We're like at a 25. So we went from 20 to 30 back to 25.
And we may not be all the way back, right? I mean, as we speak today, both countries, Canada, the US, around the world, are in different phases of opening
Absolutely.
and closing. Certainly here, we've, in Ontario, where I am, essential retail has been closed for 150 days. So
that's crazy.
We're nowhere near normal.
Yeah. And remember that old thing, that we always heard from the social sciences, it takes 3 weeks, a month, 7 weeks, depending on what, to develop new behaviors. And now the idea is, well, we can still go back to old behaviors, but the premise is that some of those new behaviors are going to stick. A good example, I think, of that is like grocery is a sector that we knew, was coming. Everybody was just more convenient to pop in and grab what you need to pop and go out. Now this sort of forced us to, and caught the grocery industry totally off guard, where our large grocery chains had like 3-week delays in delivery because they just couldn't, they couldn't keep up. My daughter was working at one of the grocery chains, said, they were doing 1,000x,
right,
what the regular volume was. So for online, and you've seen that. Now you go back into your grocery store today, and Steve, maybe in Texas it's been different. You probably more used to this than we were, but it looks like one out of every 2 people in the grocery store is a picker now.
With a gun in Texas.
Yeah.
Well, you mean a real gun? Like us, they have a digital scan gun, but
you have a symbol gun.
Yours have
I know. I
tools.
just wanted to make sure that half of our audience hates me and will track me down with something. But
I defend your right to say that and to carry arms. All right, there's my piece. Carl, I got to ask you this question: are we overthinking this? I mean, I just got off overthinking in terms of the changes. Like at the beginning of the pandemic, I was like, oh my God, this is, I rarely say this is going to change everything. I didn't think it's going to change everything, but how could consumers not be changed after 18 months of craziness? But are we over exaggerating it? I feel like today the regression to the mean of behavior is a powerful pull, but I don't know. I'm not sure any of us know, but
so the basic dynamics haven't changed, right? What makes you successful, and that's why Steve's framework is so good, because it really helps you. Like the framework didn't change when you did the second edition of the book, Steve. It's just the way that it manifested. I get what you're saying, Michael, and I struggle with this too. Like I'm not looking to create panic. I don't think that's going to serve anybody. I think we were quite underprepared.
Was it unprepared or was it built that way? I mean, really, the supply chain was built
Yeah, well, it's the same sort of thing. So the subtitle of the book is The Race to Resilience, right? And I know it's an overused term, the word resilience, acceleration, relevance. These are all things that get tossed around and sort of in the same breadbasket as innovation
Big
and all
salad.
that.
Big salad of words.
Yeah, I know. But so the idea of resilience for me is this idea where we want to head to a place. If you could head your organization to a place, and you're not going to land perfectly, but if you can lead yourself to a place where you're going to be 50-50 physical digital, then chances are if you get either a digital catastrophe, which can very much well happen, and is happening. I just read yesterday that there was the third largest beef producer in the U.S. just got hacked and got their whole system taken down. I mean, these are things like, we're going to have
Russians are busy.
Yeah, seriously. So, I mean, it's not just the physical, it's not just the resilience. I mean, obviously most organizations are underprepared digitally. And now they tried to catch up. And I'll even use, Steve, one of your, organizations that you know best than all of us, Neiman Marcus, but the CEO was talking about the need for clienteling tools. I mean, that technology has been around for a long time, and I'm not saying it's going to solve all their problems, but that should have been in place.
I have to laugh since that was one of the projects I was working on in 2005, right? So
yeah, right. So that's what I mean by unprepared. Like, they should have known. Not that a global pandemic was going to shut down the store, but I mean, that project you worked on, Steve, was maybe ahead of its time at the time, but it should have been by its time by 2020.
Yeah, to me,
right?
That's one of the questions, because I think, not to parse the whole great acceleration thing too much, but, there is this aspect of where part of what got accelerated in my mind was that retailers woke up to some realities that had already been there. Like, they just were. You couldn't, like, this idea that physical drives digital and vice versa, omni-channel, harmonized, whatever, is not a new idea. Buy online, pick up in store. Many retailers have had that for over a decade. So I think in some cases, you couldn't ignore the demand side of it, right? And I think the lesson is not necessarily to build out your structure for every eventuality. It is, I think, more to realize you don't know exactly how pace of change is going to come at you, but you better really understand it from a technology and a consumer standpoint. And you better, whether it's resilience or agility or whatever, you need to build that into your business model. There just are going to be things that happen that, you never could prepare yourself completely for. But exactly. What were those clues? What were the dynamics that were going on already that you should have been ready for?
And that's why it's the acceleration, by the way. It's not the reinvention. I mean, that's why we use the word, the word acceleration. These are all things we knew were coming. They just came to us a lot more quickly than we were prepared for. So, okay, bad on us for not having been better prepared. Now, what the real thing now is that's past. So how do we anticipate a future where we're able to, if we get knocked digitally, we're better prepared physically, and vice versa. And you're seeing that. I mean, even organizations like the good old Warby Parker that I believe are up to over 110 stores, they're adding 50 more stores. I think they're recognizing that physical, this is not put a hamper, if anything, on physical. They want to increase their physical presence. And there's great opportunities to do that because there's probably spaces for rent right now that are a little more accessible than they were before. So the more progressive organizations are going to see these opportunities, and vice versa. I mean, obviously the ones that got caught flat-footed on the digital side that didn't have the tools in place, or these are all projects that they had in the works but weren't prioritized, now are being pushed to the top. Click and collect is a great example, Steve. I mean, I remember hearing Hubert Joly last summer talk about how they've been playing around with different click and collect concepts over the years and hadn't really settled on one. And then they had 3 days basically to roll it out throughout the whole Northeast. When the opening quote I have in the book is the famous Churchill, "A crisis is a terrible thing to waste" quote. So I think that's part of the acceleration as well. And maybe one last thing too, why, are we, to your question, Michael, are we overthinking it, underthinking it? Let's not neglect that 9 of the 10 largest, most well-capitalized companies in the world have everything to gain from this acceleration.
Well, and retailers of all sizes can gain or lose, right? It is a bit of a moment, right? Because there's never been so much brand switching. I think I couldn't find it. I want to try a new channel. I want to go to a different place. Steve, we had Hubert Joly on the mic, and a consistent theme over the past couple of years on our podcast is asking people why it takes a crisis to change in retail. We should have poked around Mr. Joly a little bit on that.
Let him get away with it.
As Carl described, we kind of did. I don't know. We had lots to talk about, but if I had him on the mic again, I'd say, so, why does it take so long to make a decision? What other proof point do you need? I was talking to some executives last week about work from home, and many are saying they're going to hybrid model. And I said, well, have you told anyone that yet? Well, we're going to tell them in the fall. And my question was, what more data point are you looking for to make that decision at this point? Is it, and in truth, they said, listen, we don't need more data. It's just, we've got so many balls in the air. We can't, it's complex, right? To organize. So it wasn't that they were looking for more data. It was just prioritization of work.
It's crazy how a pandemic brings clarity really quick, huh?
But, how do you manufacture that clarity though, without a global life-threatening crisis?
You should write that
theme
book,
of
Michael.
the podcast.
That's your book. Yeah, I think you have a book in you.
Yeah, because he has
that's
a book
my book
too,
in me.
so.
Carl, is there anything as you thought about acceleration? And I want to get to this 50-50 thing that you've brought up a couple of times. So I'm not sure I'm bought in on that. Right. But I want to ask if there's anything that you thought would be accelerated and your data said hasn't, or vice versa, something you didn't think would be accelerated that did.
I was really concerned around the narrative of the sustainability piece, which is really important, I think, in the equation. And I thought that was just going to be blown out of the water. I thought people said, listen, that's nice. We'll get to it eventually. And once we get our ducks in a row and we got our financial models better settled back in place, then we can start rethinking about the bigger picture and that it was, and that quickly, at least in the interviews. And I think it wasn't just lip service. I can already see a lot of action happening around the whole build back better narrative, which is heading towards sustainability. So that sort of surprised me. It shouldn't have, I guess. I should be, it could have been, I'm usually pretty optimistic. So I should have been, not as surprised that came so rapidly back into the conversation. The other piece, which I don't know if the data necessarily backs it up and is going to be, the whole, and I've been involved in a lot of these initiatives here, as a whole shop local piece.
The Pannier Bleu, as it is.
Well, yeah, but everybody has one there. I mean, Steve, I'm sure Dallas or Dallas Fort Worth and all that. I mean, everybody has. We saw the signs go up, support your local business and all that, and that's that one. I would hope would stick more. And I just came off of a call with a merchant association here in Montreal. They're trying to think about how they can, keep building on that momentum. And I don't know how much longer we can build on that. I mean, if by this point you haven't really understood what the impacts that can have, locally on your economy and all that. So I don't know if that's answering your question directly, Michael, but I mean, that was, those are sort of two things that beyond, and we can get into the 50-50 thing, but those are sort of the things that the good and bad news, I think, of what the acceleration, has and hasn't done.
Carl, we've talked about this and you've mentioned this 50-50 deal. I'm not sure I'm bought into what that is. Maybe it's a concept, maybe it's reality, but I have a hard time imagining 50% of groceries are going to be sold online. Right. Maybe in my lifetime, maybe I just don't see it. But I'm struggling, with a country like China that is completely different, right? They started digital first, maybe in some categories, and in some categories, maybe books, maybe not. But is this a definitive? Is this a North Star? What is this 50-50 in your mind?
So the 50-50 is as much a reframing of how we categorize, and reason why also I talk with 50-50 because the hope is we stop talking about the 50-50 because once we get to closer to parity. We stopped making such a big difference, and Steve was the first, I think, to really come out with the silos idea and start breaking those down, the silos on the farms, but it belong on farms. But the idea of, so the 50-50 is this notion, when I say for the resilience, you want to head towards that. It's a cultural thing as well, the way your organization structure, and Steve talks a lot better about this than I do, but and because he's lived it, I have as well, but internally knows what those dynamics are, and so have you, Michael. But the idea of the 50-50 is also, it's not just this clear cut line between what we know today as physical and e-commerce. I agree with you. I don't think we're going to go to a place where we're 50% e-commerce, but I'm convinced we're going to go over 50% of digitally enabled commerce. I think this notion of a digital layer around us, it's thickening by the day as we're getting more and more contextual information and ways to engage. Fast Company just had an article yesterday where David Lauren, the CEO of Ralph Lauren, is basically going to wants to go to a merchandise list, no merchandise stores. That's a long word to say. So, so everything is basically created, a bespoke. That's all digitally enabled. So once you factor like click and collect, these are all things that's digitally enabled. So once I'm not just talking about sitting on your couch and ordering from Amazon. I don't think that's going to be 50%. But I think if you put all the other sort of pieces of the pie, and I'm not even talking about payment. I mean, what percentage of payment is digital now? If you put that in there, we would already be at 95%. So it's more like, think about I think we're thinking too much still in what our reference points are in 2021. This is e-commerce because I was able to buy it sitting on my couch. This is physical commerce because I had to go in the store and pick it up. That's going to blend a lot more, and that's going to really be, that's what I mean.
So isn't it not, I mean, one of the, as you probably heard me talk about, I mean, one of the problems I feel with quoting some of these numbers is, even if you just talk about e-commerce transactions that are fulfilled in a direct-to-consumer way, you've got like that's 3% grocery, right? And it's like 80% games and books, right? So I think the inherent differences, even if you wanted to go on to that sort of number, the inherent differences by category really make it irrelevant for any particular retailer, right? Because I'm not the average, right? The average person in America, Canada has one breast and one ball. So what, right? That doesn't help me with anything. But even more so,
is that I should have put that as the quote on my book. I think if I
the so some of this is just, retail's so huge, and when we talk about the averages and we talk about getting to 50-50, even if we want to anchor on that, well, that's because there will be a bunch of 90s and a few teens and some 20s, right? So I think.
Right. And the way we measure is all over the place too. And we know that, we saw that, and try to understand what e-commerce adoption is. Just compare Canada to the US. We measure in very different ways. What we include, what we don't include. And I think, which I think Michael and I are going to do a whole episode on this. Maybe we should have you back for it. But the other thing, which I think is almost, to quote the great Canadian retail strategist Alanis Morissette, it's like what's so ironic about some of the narrative, like when McKinsey had their, we've accelerated e-commerce, 10 years in 8 weeks, right? I mean, aside from the fact it was really clear that wasn't going to be true in another 8 weeks, like just by virtue of the shutdown, the most ironic thing is what actually got most accelerated, I would argue, I mean, I'd love to get some facts, is how important stores are to e-commerce, right? So there was this narrative like, oh, everything's moving online. Well, no, actually, what's moving online is research and purchasing. and it totally should be, but we can agree, Steve, that to do that, you need to get that sort of part of going to the 50-50. You're going to need a lot more digital muscle to play to that better using those physical assets, right?
Yeah, and I think
And that's really what I mean conceptually by the 50-50. Again, I'm not suggesting that we're going to a place, and I think what doesn't get talked about enough is this digital layers business, where we're just, the way we'll be engaging even in the physical store, it's going to become messier and messier to tell it apart.
Well, as Steve said, I think this is a whole other episode. Just, if we parse this out, there's 4 or 5 things we talked about today that in and of themselves could be whole episodes. Maybe that will, as Steve said, we'll get you back on season 3, which launches in July. But for now,
Steve has to go on vacation again.
I'm always on vacation.
It's taking a bit of a hiatus. It's true to recharge and to gear up for what is going to be an exciting third season. So, one thing I'm not tired of is talking with you, Carl Boutet. So thank you for joining Steve and I.
That's why he's a pro. That's why he gets the big bucks. I just slid that right in there.
Thanks again so much for joining us. We'll put a link into the show notes where they can find and access your book and your great SaaS insight service and all those great things. I wish you continued success, and I know we'll keep in touch. So it is not goodbye, but it is farewell. And thanks again for joining us on the Remarkable Retail Podcast.
As I say in French, au revoir. See you soon.
All right, we're back with another episode of Remarkable or Forgettable. Steve, let's talk about earnings. We've been talking about earnings past episode. Let's talk about Lululemon and Nordstrom, both out with earnings. What did you think?
Well, Lululemon continues to be a remarkable company. Their sales were up 88%. I don't know, again, as we've talked about, with these comparisons, it's hard to really make sense of that number. What I dug into a little bit is they're actually up 57% from 2019. So as we talked about, using that as a comparison. So that's a pretty remarkable number. Here's a fun fact. Lululemon's market value is currently $41 billion. That is twice the market cap of Macy's, Kohl's, Dillard's, and Bed Bath & Beyond combined.
Wow.
That was just kind of fun with math. So yeah, I think clearly activewear has been on fire. They've been well positioned for where the apparel growth is, but still I think they're executing incredibly well. Great margins, you name it. Nordstrom up, I think something like 44%. So not as good as a lot of the other apparel players. So they were getting beat up a little bit. There was kind of an interesting take in the news that somehow their sales were adversely affected by their store closures, like the permanent store closures. And I think that was a weird take because the stores they closed only accounted for like 5% of their total sales. So I think really what's going on here is that the kind of wearing occasions are problematic for them. They're up because they're,
doesn't matter how many stores you sell or how great your e-commerce is if nobody's going to parties and
so
less people
I
going
think,
to work and all that.
So I think that's going to be a headwind. It will be an improving picture, I think, but that's going to be a headwind for a while. So I think that, the kind of story about Nordstrom in total is kind of forgettable. They are, like Macy's and some others, really doubling down on the off-price part of their business, which has been a strong, I'm sure many people know, has been a strong component of their overall mix for a long time. I just wonder how high is up on the off-price business. I mean, there's so much competition. It's been so hot for such a long time. So I think the thing to watch with Nordstrom is, can they really get back on sustainable, profitable growth once we get kind of past the weird comparisons?
Let's talk about Warby Parker and Apple. They're both going. Who knew? Once again, who knew? Stores are important. Warby Parker and Apple both announcing more stores, not less.
Well, yeah. It turns out physical retail isn't dead. Warby Parker is going to open 35 new stores this year, they said, which I think will get them to like 150 stores in total. And to me, they're just...
Yeah, it's a big expansion on their base, right? I mean, they got 100. It's like a 30% expansion. It's not.
Right, and I think what they've found, which others have found, is that, digital drives physical, physical drives digital, and it's all one thing. And they quoted a stat, I think it was, probably get the number a little bit wrong, but 75% of their e-commerce customers have also shopped in a store. So this symbiotic relationship between digital and physical is clearly pretty strong. Apple, they were a little coy about exactly what they were doing with new stores. They got asked a question about whether they were going to close stores, I think was the context. And they said, no, actually, stores are very important to our brand. I think, bigger, obviously, than Warby Parker, but kind of the same dynamic of having that experience. They just opened a store in Rome, and they alluded to new store openings. So it's not clear how many and how fast, but they definitely are going to continue to invest behind physical retail.
Well, let's talk about moving on to resales activity. Etsy buys Depop, and Rent the Runway enters the resale. So this thing seems to be a thing. Now, we've had a guest on a prior episode talk about the resale market, and this looks like it could continue to be a thing, or is this active equity money trying to find a home and trying to grab onto a big trend?
Well, it is pretty remarkable how much activity there has been in just the last few months. I mean, it's clearly a very hot category with apparel starting to come back. It's seeing a lot of uptick there as well. Etsy buying Depop, I didn't even know who they were, but apparently they're worth about $1.6 billion because that's what Etsy paid. But it's a lower priced fashion app-based resale company. So I think in their article it said that like 90% of their customers are under the age of 26. So it's got kind of a really pronounced niche. Other end of the spectrum, Rent the Runway is more, higher end, and I think it's a pretty logical extension for them. So from that standpoint, I don't think it's pretty remarkable. But the level of activity and the growth is pretty remarkable. Again, my question here is just how high is up? Most of these different organizations, whether we're talking about Poshmark or the Real ThreadUp, they're all losing money. So what is that path to profitability? How many of these companies can actually get to profitable scale? Time will tell, but certainly it's a hot category.
Well, let's finish up on Amazon, as we often have Amazon, the news. They're talking about Prime Day. Folks coming up, talking about Prime Day, which is coming up in America in June. In Canada, it's been deferred, actually, because they're still struggling with the pandemic and their warehouse, so they've deferred to a future date. What intrigues me about Prime Day is the competitive response. So, news, for example, that Walmart and Target intend to have their own sales. Is that the best strategy, or is there another strategy where you say, listen, I'm going to ignore Prime Day as a retailer and not validate it or even make it even bigger with more publicity? I'll just, they'll have their day and I'll have my day too, but let's not make their day even bigger and more high profile. What do you think about that as a strategy?
Well, I'm going to give you a very strong, I'm not sure. The thing that makes me, I certainly think it's worth having your own day. And if you're Walmart, if you're Target, you've got the power to do that. But there's also this old expression, go hunting when the ducks are flying, right? And so Amazon just creates so much attention and so much traffic around this day. To sit it out means probably ceding a fair amount of volume. So I think in some sense they're forced to do it.
Neither Walmart, right? Neither Walmart nor Target actually have their own day. I can't think of a, Black Friday, but they don't have their own day, right?
They don't. No, they don't. And I guess my question would be, well, why not? You could certainly compete to a certain degree against Amazon just to kind of preserve market share and top of mind awareness while still doing something that's unique to your brand and in a different time frame. So, I don't know. Certainly Amazon has had this Prime Day for a number of years, and Alibaba has Singles Day, or China has Singles Day. So it's not like this is an unknown quantity, just kind of came out of left field in the last year or two. So good question. Maybe we'll see something from them later in the year.
Well, what's been remarkable to me is how Amazon's strategy is more to gain Prime members, because it's a real mishmash of product that's available on Prime Day, right? You go there and it's often their devices, which are deeply discounted. But to me, strategically seems like they're trying to grow their Prime numbers. How big is up? You mentioned, 200 million Prime members. So the interesting thing is, do you think it's remarkable or forgettable that they can continue that pace to add Prime members?
Well, I think it's gotten to the point where it's almost like, why wouldn't you have, if you can afford it, why wouldn't you have a Prime membership? But at this point, you wonder how many more people who haven't figured it out yet, can they possibly drive on this day? I agree with you. I don't think the shopping experience or the consumer value proposition on Prime Day is especially compelling. It seems more like it is, as you say, a gimmick kind of to drive even more Prime signups, which, just drives the whole Amazon flywheel. So strategically, it makes a ton of sense. I certainly would expect over time. Well, actually, I'll step back. What I was going to say is, I think over time, you would see diminishing returns from Prime Day just because the base is so big. The more that Amazon gets into physical grocery, that might create its own opportunity for some of those folks that are sitting on the fence in terms of Prime to make it worthwhile, because then they're really getting into a whole new category of frequent spending. Certainly with the number of supermarkets they have open right now, that's not an issue this year. 2 or 3 years from now might be more interesting.
Right. All right. Well, that's this episode of Remarkable or Forgettable. All right, Steve, take us home.
If you like what you heard, please follow us on Apple, Spotify, Amazon Music, or your favorite podcast platform so you can catch up with all our guest interviews and insights, and new episodes will show up every week. And please take a minute to drop us that elusive 5-star rating and tell a friend in the retail industry. I'm Steve Dennis. The expanded and completely revised second edition of my best-selling book, Remarkable Retail: How to Win and Keep Customers in the Age of Disruption, is now available at Amazon, Indigo, bookshop.org, or just about anywhere books are sold.
And I'm Michael LeBlanc, producer and host of the Voice of Retail podcast, and you can learn more about me on LinkedIn or on meleblanc.co. Steve, have a safe week.
Nice show. Not bad for Matt Day. Damn it, I forgot a line, though. Never pick it up. Never noticed it.